Hey everyone, tonight we begin with a journey back to April 14th, 1912, a night when the impossible happened to the unsinkable ship. We're diving deep into what it would have really been like to be aboard the RMS Titanic during those final terrifying hours. Not the Hollywood version with orchestras and romantic goodbyes, but the raw, freezing reality of survival against impossible odds. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this: you're standing on the deck of the largest moving object ever created by human hands. 5 city blocks long, 11 stories tall, a floating palace that cost more than some small nation's entire budgets. The Titanic wasn't just a ship, it was a statement, a declaration that humanity had conquered the ocean itself. The year is 1912, and you're about to embark on the maiden voyage of what newspapers are calling the Ship of Dreams. But here's what those newspapers didn't tell you. Here's what the White Star Line definitely didn't want you to know. Your chances of surviving what's about to happen depend entirely on 3 things: which deck you're sleeping on, how much money is in your pocket, and whether you're wearing a dress or a suit. Because in the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, this unsinkable ship is going to become a frozen graveyard at the bottom of the North Atlantic. And your survival won't depend on heroism or fate or divine intervention. It'll depend on mathematics, social class, and the cruel physics of freezing water. The truth is, most people think they know the story of the Titanic. We've all seen the movie. We know about the iceberg, the band playing as the ship went down, women and children first. But what we don't know, what history textbooks gloss over, is the brutal reality of what it actually felt like to be there. The panic, the confusion, the impossible choices that had to be made in minutes. The sounds that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Tonight, we're going to walk through every decision you would have faced, every corridor you would have navigated, every moment of terror and hope that defined those final hours. We're going to examine your chances of survival based on where you slept, what you ate for dinner, and whether you happened to be on the right side of the ship when the lifeboats started launching. Because surviving the Titanic wasn't about being brave or smart or even lucky. It was about being in the right place at the right time with the right ticket in your pocket. So let's begin with where you are when it happens. It's 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, 1912. Most passengers are asleep, though some are still up in the smoking rooms or wandering the promenade decks. The night is unusually calm, which is actually working against you. Calm seas mean no waves breaking against icebergs, making them nearly invisible in the darkness. The lookouts in the crow's nest don't have binoculars because they were left behind in Southampton, another small detail that's about to cost over 1,500 lives. If you're a first-class passenger, you're probably in one of the luxury suites on A deck or B deck. Your cabin has electric heating, a private bathroom, and windows that actually open to let in fresh sea air. You might be reading in bed, writing letters, or perhaps enjoying a nightcap while gazing out at the star-filled sky. The temperature outside is just below freezing, But inside your heated cabin, you're perfectly comfortable. You have no idea that this comfort, this proximity to the boat deck, is about to save your life. If you're traveling second class, you're likely 4 or 5 decks down in smaller but still respectable accommodations on D deck or E deck. Your cabin is clean, functional, with electric lighting and running water. You might share your space with 1 or 2 other passengers. You've probably just finished a pleasant evening in the second-class smoking room or library. The accommodations on Titanic's second class are actually better than first class on most other ships. So you feel fortunate to be here, and you are more fortunate than you realize, because second-class passengers have access to the boat deck, and that access is about to become a matter of life and death. But if you're in third-class steerage, you're deep in the bowels of the ship. F deck, G deck, some cabins even below the waterline. You're sharing a small room with strangers, perhaps a family of 6 crammed into a space barely larger than a modern walk-in closet. The walls are thin metal, painted white to make the cramped quarters feel less claustrophobic. You can hear the constant thrum of the ship's engines, the creaking of metal, the sounds of other passengers through paper-thin walls. You've probably been asleep for hours because third-class passengers don't have access to the late-night entertainment venues that keep the wealthy awake. Your location on this ship isn't just about comfort. It's about survival, because when that iceberg tears through the hull, it's going to flood the lower decks first. The watertight compartments that are supposed to save the ship are actually going to trap you. The electrical systems that power the lights in your corridor are going to fail. The elevators that could carry you to safety are going to stop working. And the locked gates that separate third class from the upper decks, the gates that exist to prevent steerage passengers from wandering into first-class areas, are going to become death traps. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, at 11:39 p.m., you don't know any of this. You're simply a passenger on the maiden voyage of the most magnificent ship ever built. You might be dreaming of your new life in America, or returning home to family, or traveling for business. You have plans for tomorrow, for next week, for next year. You have no idea that in 60 seconds, everything is going to change, because at exactly 11:40 p.m., Fleet and Lee, the lookouts in the crow's nest, are going to see something that makes their blood run cold. A dark shape looming out of the starlit night directly ahead of the ship. An iceberg, massive and silent, invisible until it's too late to avoid. Fleet will reach for the telephone to call the bridge, his hands shaking as he rings 3 times. Iceberg right ahead, he'll shout into the receiver. On the bridge, First Officer Murdoch will order hard a starboard and full astern. He'll try to port around the iceberg while reversing the engines. For 37 seconds, it will seem like it might work. The ship will begin to turn, the massive iceberg sliding along the starboard side. Some passengers will wake up to a strange grinding sound, like the ship is running over 1,000 marbles. Others will feel a slight vibration, nothing more dramatic than a subway train changing tracks. But below the waterline, something catastrophic is happening. The iceberg isn't just scraping against the hull, it's puncturing it, not with one massive gash, as most people imagine, but with a series of small holes and opened seams along 300 feet of the ship's starboard side. Water is pouring into the forward compartments at a rate of over 400 tons per minute. The ship that was designed to survive flooding in 4 compartments is taking on water in 6. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, is asleep in his first-class cabin when the impact occurs. He'll be awakened by the slight tremor, and his trained engineer's instincts will tell him immediately that something is wrong. Within minutes, he'll be dressed and making his way to the bridge to assess the damage. What he discovers will confirm his worst fears. The Titanic has maybe 2 hours before she goes under. Captain Smith, awakened by the collision, will make his way to the bridge in his pajamas and overcoat. The wireless operators will be instructed to send out distress calls. The lifeboats will be ordered uncovered and swung out. But here's what most people don't realize about those lifeboats. They're not meant to save everyone on board. They're designed for ferrying passengers from a disabled ship to a rescue vessel, not for surviving in the open ocean. The Titanic carries lifeboats for only 1,178 people. There are 2,224 souls aboard. Even if every lifeboat had been filled to capacity, which they won't be, over 1,000 people were doomed from the moment the ship hit that iceberg. The mathematics are simple and brutal. 37% of the people on this ship are going to die tonight, and which 37% depends largely on factors completely beyond their control. Your cabin class, your gender, your age, even which side of the ship you happen to be on when the lifeboats start loading, because the Titanic is going to sink by the bow, tilting forward as water floods the forward compartments. This means the lifeboats on the port side, the left side of the ship, will be harder to launch as the ship develops a list to starboard. Fewer people will escape from the port side boats, and many of those boats will launch only half full because the deck is tilting away from the water. But right now, at 11:41 p.m., 1 minute after the collision, most passengers don't even know anything has happened. You might have felt a slight bump, a vibration that lasted maybe 10 seconds. Some passengers will later describe it as feeling like the ship had run over a giant fish. Others will say it felt like a train stopping suddenly. Many won't feel anything at all. If you're awake, you might notice that the engines have stopped. The constant vibration that has been your companion for the past 4 days suddenly ceases. The ship feels eerily quiet, almost peaceful. Some passengers will assume they've stopped to avoid ice fields, a common precaution in these waters. Others will go back to sleep, figuring that whatever happened, it's been handled by the crew. The crew, however, is beginning to understand the scope of the disaster. Down in the boiler rooms, the Black Gang, the men who shovel coal into the massive furnaces that power the ship, are fighting a losing battle against incoming water. Boiler Room 6 is flooding rapidly. The watertight doors have been closed, but water is pouring over the top of the bulkheads. These men, many of whom will die in the next 2 hours, are buying precious time for the passengers above by keeping the power on as long as possible. Meanwhile, the postal clerks are trying to save the mail, dragging heavy sacks up from the flooding mailroom to higher decks. They'll work until the very end, these men, dying at their posts, rather than abandon their duty. Their bodies will never be recovered, but for most passengers, the first sign that something is seriously wrong won't come for another 10 or 15 minutes. That's when stewards will begin knocking on cabin doors, telling passengers to put on life belts and come up on deck. The instructions will be polite, almost casual. The captain would like everyone to put on their life belts and come up on deck as a precautionary measure. No sense of urgency, no mention of danger. This is crucial to understand about your chances of survival. The crew doesn't want to cause panic, so they're downplaying the seriousness of the situation. Many passengers will assume this is just a drill, an inconvenience that will be over shortly. They'll take their time getting dressed, gathering their valuables, saying goodbye to friends in other cabins. Every minute they delay is a minute closer to death. If you're in first class, a steward will come to your door personally. He'll help you with your life belt, escort you to the boat deck, perhaps even carry your luggage. If you're in second class, you might get a brief knock and instructions to make your way topside. If you're in third class, you might not get any warning at all. You might only realize something is wrong when you hear shouting in the corridors, when you see other passengers running, when you feel the ship beginning to list forward and to starboard. Your survival depends on what you do in the next 20 minutes, and most passengers are about to make fatal mistakes. If you're a first-class passenger, you have advantages you don't even realize yet. Your cabin is close to the boat deck. You have warm clothes readily available. You're accustomed to being helped by the crew, so when a steward appears at your door, you'll likely follow his instructions without question. But here's where many wealthy passengers go wrong. They assume their money can buy them safety, that their status means they'll be taken care of. Some will go back to their cabins for jewelry, for family heirlooms, for documents they think they'll need, time they don't have. Margaret Brown, who will later be known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, makes the right choice. When the steward knocks on her door at 12:15 a.m., she immediately puts on her warmest clothes, grabs her life belt, and heads for the boat deck. She doesn't waste time packing. She doesn't stop to powder her nose. She understands instinctively that this is not a drill. Her decisiveness will save her life. But Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining heir, makes a different choice. He returns to his cabin to change into evening dress. "We've dressed our best," he tells his valet, "and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." It's a noble sentiment that will cost him his life. Gentlemen don't survive disasters. Fast movers do. If you're in second class, your situation is more precarious. You have farther to travel to reach the lifeboats, and the corridors you need to navigate are about to become crowded with panicking passengers. The smart second-class passengers are the ones who immediately head for the upper decks without stopping to gather belongings. They push past slower-moving passengers, ignore social niceties, and focus solely on getting topside. But many second-class passengers make the mistake of being too polite, too orderly. They wait their turn in corridors. They help elderly passengers who are moving slowly. They stop to comfort crying children who aren't their own. Every act of kindness costs precious minutes they don't have. The Titanic rewards selfishness, not heroism. The third-class passengers face the greatest challenges, and most of them don't even know it yet. The gates that separate steerage from the upper decks are still locked. The crew members who have keys are either busy with other duties or don't understand the urgency of the situation. Some third-class passengers will spend critical minutes trying to find alternate routes to the upper decks, wandering through unfamiliar corridors, getting lost in the maze of the ship's lower levels. Others will wait patiently for crew members to unlock the gates, trusting that the authorities know what they're doing. This trust will kill them. The passengers who survive from third class are the ones who ignore rules, who climb over locked gates, who push past crew members trying to maintain order. They're the ones who understand that social conventions are luxuries they can't afford. By midnight, 40 minutes after the collision, the ship's band has assembled in the first-class lounge and begun playing ragtime music. This isn't the romantic gesture portrayed in movies. It's a calculated attempt to keep passengers calm, to maintain the illusion that everything is under control. The music masks the sound of rushing water, the groaning of stressed metal, the shouts of crew members trying to ready the lifeboats. The first lifeboat won't be launched until 12:45 a.m., over an hour after the collision. This delay is costing lives. Every minute the ship remains afloat, more water pours into the hull. The bow sinks lower, the stern rises higher, and the angle of the deck becomes more treacherous. Passengers who might have easily stepped into lifeboats at midnight will find themselves trying to climb down rope ladders from a ship listing at dangerous angles. The lifeboats themselves present their own deadly mathematics. Boat 7, launched from the starboard side, carries only 27 people despite having capacity for 65. The crew loading it can't believe the ship is actually sinking. They figure they'll row around for a few hours while the pumps handle the flooding, then return to pick up more passengers. This optimism costs 38 lives. Meanwhile, Boat 6 on the port side launches with only 28 passengers, including Margaret Brown. The boat is under the command of Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, who will refuse to return to pick up swimmers from the water. It's no use, he'll tell the other passengers. They're all dead anyway. His cowardice will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. If you're a woman or child, your chances of survival are dramatically better, but only if you can reach the lifeboats. The Women and Children First protocol is being enforced more strictly on the port side than the starboard side. On the starboard side, Second Officer Lightoller is allowing men into boats only after all nearby women and children have been loaded. On the port side, First Officer Murdoch is filling boats with whoever is available, men included. Your survival might depend on which side of the ship you approach, but here's what the protocol doesn't account for. Many women refuse to leave their husbands. Ida Strauss won't get into a lifeboat without Isidore. "We have lived together for 40 years, she tells the crew member trying to help her. "Where you go, I go." Their love story will become legend, but their devotion will kill them both. Other women are simply terrified of getting into small boats and being lowered 60 feet to the dark ocean. The lifeboats look fragile compared to the massive ship. Some women watch the first few boats launch and decide they'd rather take their chances on the Titanic. They don't understand that the ship is doomed, that these flimsy boats are their only hope of survival. Children face their own unique dangers. Many are separated from parents in the chaos. Some are too young to understand the urgency, moving slowly when they need to move fast. Others panic completely, becoming dead weight that slows down entire families. The children who survive are the ones with decisive adults who grab them and run, who don't waste time explaining what's happening or negotiating about leaving toys behind. By 1 a.m., the situation is becoming desperate. The ship is noticeably down by the bow. Water has reached A deck in the forward sections. The lights are still on, the band is still playing, but crew members are beginning to show signs of panic. Some are drinking heavily from the ship's liquor stores. Others are abandoning their posts entirely. The wireless operators are sending increasingly frantic messages. CQD, SOS, CQD, SOS, we are sinking fast. Come quickly, our engine room flooded. The nearest ship, the Californian, has shut down its radio for the night. The Carpathia is racing toward them, but won't arrive for another 3 hours. Too late for most. This is when passenger behavior becomes truly revealing. Some rise to heroism they never knew they possessed. John Jacob Astor helps his pregnant wife into Lifeboat 4, then steps back to die like a gentleman. The sea is calm, he tells her. You'll be all right. You're in good hands. He kisses her goodbye and disappears into the crowd of doomed passengers. Others reveal cowardice that will stain their reputations forever. White Star Line managing director J. Bruce Esme slips into collapsible sea just as it's being launched, taking a seat that could have gone to a woman or child. He'll survive the sinking, but never recover from the shame of his escape. Most passengers fall somewhere between these extremes. They're confused, frightened people making impossible decisions with incomplete information. They don't know the ship is doomed. They don't understand that these might be their last moments alive. They're operating on social conventions designed for normal times, not for disasters where normal rules don't apply. The crew's behavior is equally mixed. Some officers work tirelessly to load lifeboats and maintain order. Others seem paralyzed by the magnitude of the disaster. Many don't fully understand how quickly the ship is sinking. They've been trained for fires, for mechanical failures, for medical emergencies. No one trained them for this. Captain Smith moves through the chaos like a ghost. He gives few orders, makes no speeches, seems overwhelmed by the scale of the catastrophe. Some witnesses will later claim he was heroic in his final hours. Others will describe him as ineffective, paralyzed by indecision. The truth is probably somewhere in between. He was a man facing an impossible situation with inadequate resources and no good options. By 1:30 a.m., the ship's list to starboard has become pronounced. Passengers walking the decks have to hold onto railings to keep their balance. The angle makes it difficult to launch lifeboats on the port side. Several boats scrape against the ship's hull as they're lowered, terrifying the passengers inside. The band, now led by bandleader Wallace Hartley, has moved to the boat deck and continues playing. They've switched from ragtime to hymns. Nearer My God to Thee will become part of Titanic legend, though survivors disagree about whether it was actually the last song played. What matters is that these men continue performing even as death approaches, trying to provide comfort to passengers who have no hope of escape. This is when the true horror begins for those still trapped on the ship. The forward well deck is now underwater. Passengers can see the ocean creeping up the ship toward them, swallowing deck after deck. The angle of the ship makes walking difficult, then dangerous, then impossible. People begin sliding down the tilting decks into the rising water. The electrical systems are failing section by section. Lights flicker and go out. Emergency lighting kicks in, casting eerie shadows across scenes of growing panic. The elevators have stopped working entirely. Passengers trapped on lower decks face a nightmarish climb up tilting stairways that are becoming steeper with every passing minute. In third class, the situation has become truly desperate. Many steerage passengers still haven't reached the upper decks. Some are trapped behind locked gates with no crew members to help them. Others are lost in corridors they don't recognize, corridors that are filling with water. The passengers who escape from third class are the ones who break rules, who smash through barriers, who ignore orders to wait their turn. The final lifeboats are being prepared, but there's no longer any pretense of orderly evacuation. Collapsible A and B haven't been properly prepared. They're still tied to the roof of the officers' quarters when the water reaches them. Passengers and crew members work frantically to free them as the ship's angle becomes more severe. At 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat is launched. There are still over 1,500 people on the ship. The final lifeboats are disappearing into the darkness, and for those still aboard the Titanic, reality is setting in with crushing finality. The deck beneath your feet is no longer level. It's tilting at an angle that makes walking treacherous, then impossible. You have to hold onto railings, deck chairs, anything bolted down to keep from sliding toward the rising water. The ship that once felt as solid as a city block now groans and shudders with each passing minute. If you're still on the ship at this point, your survival depends on a series of split-second decisions that most people get wrong. The natural human instinct is to move away from water, to climb higher, to seek the safety of elevation. But on the Titanic, this instinct will kill you. The stern, the back of the ship, seems safer because it's higher out of the water. Hundreds of passengers are clinging to the railings back there, thinking they've found temporary refuge. They don't realize they're about to experience something far worse than drowning. Your best chance now, your only chance, is to get into the water before the ship goes under completely. Not later, when you're forced into it by the ship's final plunge, but now, while you still have some control over how you enter the ocean. This goes against every survival instinct you possess. The water temperature is 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 4 degrees below freezing. Salt water doesn't freeze at 32 degrees, which is the only reason it's still liquid. Getting into this water feels like suicide, and in many ways it is. But staying on the ship is certain death. The passengers who survive the next 20 minutes are the ones who understand this terrible mathematics. They're the ones who overcome their terror of the freezing ocean and jump before they're forced to jump. They find life preservers, wooden deck chairs, anything that floats, and they get as far away from the ship as possible before it makes its final dive. Charles Lightoller, the second officer, makes this calculation correctly. As the ship's bridge goes underwater, he jumps and swims hard to get clear of the suction. The water hits him like thousands of knives, but he keeps swimming. He'll later say that the cold was so intense, it felt like his body was being crushed in a giant ice cube. But he survives because he chose his moment to enter the water, rather than letting the ship choose for him. Most passengers don't make this choice. They cling to the ship until the very end, hoping against hope that rescue will arrive, that the ship will somehow stabilize, that someone will save them. Human psychology isn't designed for situations like this. We're wired to seek shelter, to avoid pain, to trust that authority figures know what they're doing. All of these instincts work against survival on a sinking ship. At 2:10 a.m., the water reaches the ship's name painted on the bow. Titanic disappears letter by letter beneath the black surface. The forward funnel, one of the ship's massive smokestacks, breaks free and crashes into the ocean, crushing swimmers who were trying to get clear. The sound is indescribable, metal tearing, rivets popping, the death scream of the largest moving object ever built by human hands. The ship's lights flicker one final time, then go out completely. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was last seen in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting called The Approach to the New World. He'd removed his life belt and seemed lost in thought. The ship he'd spent years designing was about to become his tomb, and he knew it. His body was never found. Captain Smith's final moments remain a mystery. Some survivors claimed they saw him swimming in the water, trying to reach Collapsible B. Others said he went down with the bridge. One account has him handing a baby to a passenger before disappearing into the chaos. The truth died with him. What we know is that he never made it into a lifeboat, never abandoned his post, never saved himself while his passengers drowned. The band played until the very end. Wallace Hartley, the bandmaster, was found days later, still wearing his uniform, his violin case strapped to his body. Whether their final song was Nearer My God to Thee, or Autumn, or some other hymn hardly matters. What matters is that they provided comfort and dignity in humanity's darkest hour, that they chose service over self-preservation. At 2:17 a.m., something happens that defies everything engineers thought they knew about ship construction. The Titanic breaks apart. The stress of the ship's angle, the weight of water in the forward compartments, the buoyancy of the stern trying to rise, creates forces that exceed what the hull was designed to withstand. Between the third and fourth funnels, the ship snaps like a stick. The sound of the ship breaking apart is heard miles away. Survivors in lifeboats describe it as the most terrifying sound they'd ever heard, worse than screaming, worse than the roar of rushing water. It's the sound of 15,000 tons of steel being torn apart by forces beyond human comprehension. Rivets shoot out like bullets. Steel plates buckle and fold. The ship's spine breaks with a crack that echoes across the North Atlantic. For passengers still aboard, this is the moment when hope dies completely. The forward section, already flooded, disappears beneath the waves within minutes. The stern section, suddenly free of the weight dragging it down, actually rights itself briefly. For a few seconds, it bobs almost level on the water, and passengers trapped aboard feel a moment of impossible hope. Maybe this section will float. Maybe rescue is possible. But the stern has massive holes where it tore away from the forward section. Water pours into the breach faster than any pump could handle. The stern section fills and begins its own final plunge, this time straight down, like an elevator dropping into the abyss. If you're still on the stern when this happens, you experience something that haunts survivors' nightmares for decades afterward. The deck doesn't just tilt, it goes vertical. Passengers, deck chairs, lifeboats, everything loose slides down toward the water, like items falling off a table. People claw at smooth deck plates, trying to find handholds that don't exist. Some are crushed by sliding debris. Others simply fall, tumbling 60 feet into the freezing ocean. The fortunate ones, if you can call anyone in this situation fortunate, are thrown clear of the ship and into the water while they're still conscious and able to swim. The unlucky ones are trapped inside the stern section as it makes its final dive, dragged down into the depths in pockets of air that become underwater tombs. At 2:20 a.m., 2 hours and 40 minutes after striking the iceberg, the Titanic disappears completely beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. The largest ship in the world becomes a memory, a grave site, a cautionary tale about human hubris and the power of nature. But for the 1,500 people now in the water, the real horror is just beginning. The ship's death throes have created a maelstrom of debris, wreckage, and human beings struggling to survive in water cold enough to kill in minutes. This is when you discover that all your planning, all your decisions about which lifeboat to approach and when to jump might not matter if you can't survive the next 30 minutes in the ocean. The cold hits you like a physical blow. Your entire body goes into shock. Your heart rate spikes. Your breathing becomes rapid and shallow. Your muscles seize. This is called cold shock response, and it kills people within minutes, even when they're wearing life preservers. Your body temperature doesn't have time to drop to hypothermic levels. The shock alone stops your heart or causes you to inhale water and drown. Some passengers die within seconds of hitting the water. Their hearts simply stop, overwhelmed by the temperature change. Others last longer, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, fighting to stay conscious as their core body temperature plummets. A few, the ones wearing the best life preservers and positioned furthest from the ship's suction, manage to stay alive long enough for rescue. The sounds from the water are what survivors remember most vividly decades later. 1,500 people crying for help, praying, calling out names of loved ones. The sound rises and falls like a terrible chorus, echoing across the calm ocean. Some lifeboats are close enough to hear individual voices, passengers calling out the names of husbands, wives, children they've been separated from in the chaos. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Most of the lifeboats don't go back. They're less than half full, with room for dozens more passengers, but they don't return to pick up survivors from the water. The passengers in the boats are terrified that desperate swimmers will swamp their lifeboats, drowning everyone. They row away from the screaming and the pleading, away from the people they might still save. Only one lifeboat returns. Lifeboat 14, under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, goes back after waiting for the voices to quiet down. By then, it's too late for most. Lowe pulls only 5 people from the water, and one of those dies in the boat. 1,500 people in the water, and the lifeboats save 5. The mathematics of cowardice are as brutal as the mathematics of the sinking itself. The voices from the water don't last long. Within 15 minutes, the chorus of cries becomes scattered individual calls. Within 30 minutes, there's mostly silence. The human body can't survive long in 28-degree water, no matter how strong the will to live. Hypothermia shuts down the nervous system, stops the heart, brings merciful unconsciousness to people who have endured the unendurable. Margaret Brown, the woman who will become known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, tries to convince the other passengers in Lifeboat 6 to row back and pick up survivors. Quartermaster Hitchens refuses, claiming that desperate swimmers will drag them all down. Brown threatens to throw him overboard if he doesn't turn the boat around. The argument continues for nearly an hour, while people in the water freeze to death within earshot. In Lifeboat 1, only 12 people occupy a boat designed for 40. Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife could easily have saved 28 more lives, but they're afraid of being overwhelmed by panicking swimmers. They sit in their half-empty boat, listening to the screams from the water, and do nothing. Duff Gordon will later be investigated by the British Board of Trade for his conduct that night, though he'll never face criminal charges. The temperature of survival isn't just about the water. It's about the moral temperature of human beings under extreme stress. Some passengers in the lifeboats reveal nobility that surprises even them. Others show cowardice that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Most fall somewhere in between, ordinary people making impossible choices with limited information and overwhelming fear. As the voices from the water fade to silence, the passengers in the lifeboats face their own survival challenges. They're dressed in night clothes and life preservers, exposed to freezing air temperatures with no shelter. Some boats have emergency supplies, others don't. Some have experienced seamen to manage them. Others are commanded by passengers who've never been in a small boat before. The lifeboats begin to spread out across several miles of ocean. Some stay relatively close together, their passengers calling out to maintain contact in the darkness. Others drift apart, becoming isolated specks on the vast North Atlantic. Communication between boats becomes impossible as distance and wind scatter them across the search area. In Collapsible B, which landed upside down when the ship sank, 30 men balance precariously on the overturned hull. They're standing in water up to their knees, holding onto each other for warmth and stability. Every few minutes, someone loses their grip and falls into the ocean. Second Officer Lightoller organizes them into a human chain, making sure the weight is distributed evenly so the collapsible doesn't sink completely. These men will spend the next 4 hours balancing on an overturned boat in freezing temperatures, taking turns being on the outside of the human chain where the wind and spray are worst. Some will survive until rescue arrives. Others will simply let go during the night, slipping into the water without a word when the cold and exhaustion become unbearable. By 3 a.m., an hour after the ship disappeared, the immediate crisis has passed for those in the lifeboats. The screaming from the water has stopped. The debris field has settled. The ocean has returned to its deceptive calm as if nothing had happened. Stars reflect on the surface like scattered diamonds, beautiful and cold, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. Now survival becomes a waiting game. The Carpathia is racing toward them through ice fields, but it won't arrive until dawn. The passengers in the lifeboats must endure 4 more hours of freezing temperatures, uncertain rescue, and the psychological trauma of what they've witnessed. Some boats have blankets and emergency supplies. Others have nothing but the clothes passengers grabbed as they fled their cabins. The social dynamics in the lifeboats become their own study in human nature. Class distinctions that seemed so important on the ship begin to break down when everyone is equally cold and frightened. Margaret Brown organizes the women in her boat to row in shifts, keeping everyone active and warm. In other boats, passengers huddle together, regardless of whether they knew each other before, sharing body heat and whispered prayers. Some passengers never recover from the guilt of survival, They'll spend the rest of their lives asking why they lived when so many others died. Survivor's guilt becomes a recognized condition, partly because of Titanic survivors who couldn't reconcile their good fortune with the deaths of 1,500 other people. Others find strength they didn't know they possessed. Women who had never done physical labor row lifeboats for hours. Men who had lived lives of privilege organize survival efforts and care for strangers' children. Children who had been pampered and protected show remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma. As dawn approaches on April 15th, 1912, the passengers in the lifeboats begin to see each other clearly for the first time since the sinking. They're a bedraggled group, dressed in whatever they could grab, many showing signs of frostbite and exposure. Some boats have maintained better morale than others. Some passengers have given up hope entirely. At 3:30 a.m., rockets appear on the horizon. The Carpathia has arrived and is firing rockets to let the survivors know help is coming. The relief in the lifeboats is overwhelming. Passengers who had maintained stoic composure for hours break down and weep. Others begin praying aloud, thanking God for their deliverance. A few simply stare at the approaching lights, too emotionally exhausted to react. But rescue brings its own challenges. The sea is still rough enough to make transferring passengers from lifeboats to ship dangerous. Some of the lifeboats are damaged and taking on water. Passengers who have been sitting motionless for hours find they can barely move, their joints stiff from cold and inactivity. The Carpathia's crew performs heroically, rigging rope ladders and lifting nets to bring survivors aboard. They give up their own cabins to accommodate the rescued passengers, sharing clothes, food, and medical care with strangers. Captain Arthur Rostron becomes a hero for his decision to race through ice fields at full speed, risking his own ship to reach the Titanic survivors as quickly as possible. As the sun rises over the North Atlantic, the full scope of the disaster becomes clear. Of the 20 lifeboats launched from the Titanic, 18 reach the Carpathia safely. 2 collapsibles are barely afloat, their passengers in desperate condition from exposure. The sea around the rescue site is littered with debris, life preservers, and bodies of those who didn't survive the night in the water. The final count is devastating, but not surprising to anyone who understands the mathematics of the disaster. 710 passengers and crew members survive. 1,514 die. The survival rate varies dramatically by class and gender, just as the layout of the ship and the loading of the lifeboats predetermined. First-class passengers had a 60% survival rate. Second-class passengers had a 42% survival rate. Third-class passengers had a 24% survival rate. The numbers tell the story more clearly than any testimony about what really happened during those 2 hours and 40 minutes. Women survived at a rate of 74%. Men survived at a rate of 20%. Children had better odds than adult men, but worse odds than adult women. Even in disaster, social hierarchies determined who lived and who died. Your chances of surviving the Titanic weren't about heroism or divine intervention. They were about mathematics, physics, and social class. If you were a first-class woman, you had an excellent chance of survival. If you were a third-class man, you were almost certainly doomed. Everything else, all the individual stories of courage and cowardice, played out within these predetermined parameters. The Titanic disaster reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization. When resources are scarce and time is limited, societies revert to their most basic hierarchies. Money, gender, and social status become matters of life and death. The veneer of civilization proves remarkably thin when survival is at stake. But the story also reveals remarkable human resilience and adaptability. Passengers who had never faced real hardship found strength they didn't know they possessed. Crew members who might have been ordinary seamen in normal circumstances became heroes who died saving strangers. The disaster brought out both the worst and the best in human nature, sometimes in the same person within the span of the hours. As the Carpathia steams toward New York with its cargo of traumatized survivors, the world begins to grapple with questions that will haunt maritime safety for generations. How could the unsinkable ship have sunk? How could so many lives have been lost in what should have been a routine passenger voyage? The answers reveal a cascade of failures, small decisions that compounded into catastrophe, human errors that turned a survivable accident into one of history's deadliest peacetime maritime disasters. The iceberg that sank the Titanic had been drifting south for years, calving off a glacier in Greenland sometime around 1910. It was massive, weighing an estimated 1.5 million tons, with only 10% of its bulk visible above the waterline. On any other night, the lookouts might have spotted it in time. But this night, conditions conspired against survival in ways that seem almost deliberately cruel. The sea was unusually calm, what sailors call a flat calm. Under normal conditions, waves breaking against the base of an iceberg create a visible line of foam that can be spotted from miles away. But with no waves, no foam, the iceberg was invisible against the star-filled sky until it was too late to avoid. The lookouts in the crow's nest had been straining their eyes for hours, searching for ice in conditions that made ice nearly impossible to see. The missing binoculars were just one of many small failures that added up to disaster. The binoculars that should have been in the crow's nest were locked in a cabinet, and the officer who had the key had been transferred off the ship at the last minute in Southampton. It was a minor administrative oversight that cost 1,500 lives. The lookouts had requested binoculars repeatedly during the voyage, but were told to use their naked eyes. Even the ship's design, praised as revolutionary and unsinkable, contributed to the disaster in ways no one anticipated. The watertight bulkheads that were supposed to contain flooding only extended partway up the hull. When water flooded the forward compartments, it simply spilled over the top of the bulkheads into adjacent compartments, like water flowing over ice cube trays. The ship's own safety features became a death trap. The steel used in the ship's construction was of good quality by 1912 standards, but it became brittle in cold water. The rivets holding the hull plates together were a mixture of iron and steel, and the iron rivets were more likely to fail under stress. When the iceberg struck, it didn't tear a gash in the hull as most people imagine. Instead, it popped rivets and opened seams along 300 feet of the ship's starboard side, creating multiple points of flooding that overwhelmed the pumping systems. The crew's response to the disaster was hampered by a lack of emergency training and confused command structure. There had been no lifeboat drill during the voyage. Many crew members didn't know how to operate the davits used to lower the lifeboats. Others didn't understand the gravity of the situation until it was too late to mount an effective response. Captain Smith, despite his experience and reputation, made critical errors in judgment that cost lives. He maintained course and speed through a known ice field, ignoring multiple warnings from other ships about ice conditions ahead. When the collision occurred, he failed to send out distress signals immediately, wasting precious time that could have been used to summon help. The wireless system, a cutting-edge technology for 1912, proved inadequate for the emergency. The Titanic's distress calls reached several ships, but most were too far away to help. The Californian, only 19 miles away, had shut down its radio for the night. The wireless operator had gone to bed, leaving the ship deaf to the Titanic's desperate pleas for assistance. Even the weather conspired against survival. The night was unusually cold, even for April in the North Atlantic. The air temperature was just below freezing, but the water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill a healthy adult in 15 minutes or less. The calm conditions that made the iceberg invisible also prevented rescue ships from seeing the disaster from a distance. There were no waves to create phosphorescence, no white caps to reflect moonlight. The ship's electrical system, designed to provide luxury and comforts, became another factor in the death toll. When the forward sections flooded, the electrical generators were among the first systems to fail. Emergency lighting was limited, and much of the ship's lower decks plunged into darkness just when passengers needed light most to find their way to safety. The class-based segregation that defined Edwardian society was literally built into the ship's design. Third-class passengers were housed in the lower decks, farthest from the lifeboats, and separated from the upper decks by locked gates and barriers. These weren't just social conventions. They were physical obstacles that prevented escape when every second counted. The crew members responsible for third-class passengers were often overwhelmed or simply abandoned their posts as the situation deteriorated. Some gates remained locked throughout the disaster. Others were opened only after desperate passengers broke them down or climbed over them. The ship's layout, designed to maintain social order, became a death trap for the poor. But perhaps the most tragic failure was psychological rather than mechanical. Most passengers and crew members simply couldn't believe that the Titanic could actually sink. The ship's reputation for safety was so strong that many people refused to take the danger seriously, even as water rose around their feet. Passengers returned to their cabins for valuables, convinced they'd be back aboard within hours. Crew members loaded lifeboats with only half their capacity, certain they were taking unnecessary precautions. Even as the ship developed a noticeable list, many people preferred to stay aboard rather than climb into small boats and be lowered into the dark ocean. This psychological denial extended to the ship's officers. They had been trained to handle mechanical failures, fires, medical emergencies, but not total loss of the ship. Their emergency procedures assumed the ship would remain afloat long enough for rescue vessels to arrive. When it became clear that the Titanic was actually going to sink completely, many crew members were unprepared mentally and practically for mass evacuation. The loading of the lifeboats reveals how quickly social order breaks down under extreme stress. The women and children first protocol was enforced differently on different parts of the ship, depending on which officers were in charge and how they interpreted their duties. Some boats launched with only women and children. Others included men when no more women were immediately available. A few launched nearly empty because crew members couldn't believe the ship was really in danger. The time factor proved more crucial than anyone realized. The Titanic had approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes from impact to final sinking. This sounds like a reasonable amount of time to evacuate 2,224 people, but the practical realities made it insufficient. Getting dressed, finding lifebelts, navigating unfamiliar corridors, waiting for lifeboats to be prepared and loaded, each step took precious minutes that weren't available. The lifeboats themselves were designed for a different type of emergency. They were meant to ferry passengers from a disabled ship to a nearby rescue vessel, not to serve as survival craft in the open ocean. They lacked adequate supplies, proper navigation equipment, and sufficient protection from the elements. Many were overcrowded, others underfilled. Most were commanded by crew members with limited small boat experience. The decision-making process during the evacuation reveals how class and gender expectations shaped survival chances in ways that go beyond simple access to lifeboats. Wealthy passengers often delayed their evacuation to gather valuables or say elaborate farewells. Working-class passengers, more accustomed to taking orders from authority figures, sometimes waited for permission that never came. Women faced impossible choices between social expectations and survival instincts. Many refused to leave their husbands, especially older couples who had been married for decades. Others were terrified of the lifeboats and preferred to take their chances on the ship. Some were physically forced into lifeboats by crew members or male relatives who understood the danger better than they did. Children's survival often depended on adult decision-making rather than their own actions. Families that moved quickly and decisively had better survival rates. Those that delayed, argued, or split up often lost children in the chaos. Some parents put children in lifeboats expecting to follow in the next boat, not realizing there might not be a next boat. The crew's performance varied wildly from heroic to cowardly to simply confused. Some officers worked tirelessly to load lifeboats and maintain order until the ship went under. Others abandoned their posts or froze under pressure. Many were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster and simply didn't know how to respond effectively. The ship's musicians, led by band leader Wallace Hartley, provided one of the few bright spots in an otherwise dark story. They assembled on deck and played music for nearly 2 hours, helping to keep passengers calm as the evacuation proceeded. None of them survived, but their sacrifice became legendary, symbolizing duty and dignity in the face of certain death. As the Carpathia approaches New York Harbor with the Titanic survivors, the world waits for answers that will reshape how we think about safety, technology, and human nature under extreme stress. The survivors carry with them not just the trauma of their experience, but lessons that will influence maritime safety regulations for the next century. The disaster exposes the fatal flaw in early 20th century thinking about technology and progress. The belief that human engineering could conquer nature, that bigger and more complex necessarily meant safer and better, proved tragically wrong. The Titanic's designers created a ship that was magnificent, but not seaworthy enough for the conditions it would face. The social implications prove equally devastating. The survival statistics reveal how quickly civilized society reverts to its most basic hierarchies when resources become scarce. Money bought safety. Gender determined priority. Social class predicted survival chances with mathematical precision. These weren't accidents or coincidences. They were the predictable results of a system designed to value some lives more than others. But the disaster also reveals remarkable human capacity for heroism under impossible circumstances. Passengers helped strangers. Crew members died at their posts. Individuals made split-second decisions that saved lives they'd never meet again. The same crisis that brought out the worst in human nature also brought out the best. The survivors face a lifetime of survivor's guilt, recurring nightmares, and questions they can never fully answer. Why did they live when so many others died? Could they have done more to save additional lives? Were they heroes for surviving or cowards for not dying? These questions will haunt them long after their physical wounds heal. The families of the lost face their own trauma. Wives who said goodbye to husbands at the lifeboat davits. Children who watched parents disappear into the crowd of doomed passengers. Parents who put children in lifeboats and never saw them again. The emotional wreckage of the Titanic disaster spreads far beyond those who were physically present that night. The maritime industry begins implementing changes even before the Carpathia reaches New York. Ships will carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. Radio watches will be maintained 24 hours a day. Ice patrols will track iceberg movements and warn ships of dangerous conditions. The lessons written in blood and ice water will save thousands of lives in future disasters. But some lessons prove harder to learn. The tendency to prioritize luxury over safety, to trust technology more than human judgment, to maintain social hierarchies even in life and death situations. These patterns repeat themselves in disasters throughout the 20th century and beyond. The Titanic becomes more than just a shipwreck. It becomes a symbol of human hubris, a cautionary tale about the limits of technology, a mirror that reflects both our highest aspirations and our darkest impulses. The ship that was supposed to represent the triumph of human achievement instead becomes a monument to human fallibility. Your chances of surviving the Titanic weren't determined by your courage, your intelligence, or your moral character. They were determined by factors largely beyond your control. Your ticket class, your cabin location, your gender, your age, even which side of the ship you happened to be on when the lifeboats started loading. The disaster reveals uncomfortable truths about how societies function under extreme stress, truths that many people would prefer to forget. But perhaps the most important lesson is that survival often comes down to small decisions made quickly under enormous pressure. The passengers who survived were often those who recognized the danger early, moved decisively, and refused to be paralyzed by the magnitude of the disaster. They didn't wait for perfect information or official permission. They acted on incomplete knowledge and trusted their instincts over social conventions. As the Carpathia's lights appear on the horizon and rescue becomes reality for the 710 survivors, they carry with them a story that will be told and retold for more than a century, a story of human ambition and human failure, of technology's promise and technology's limits, of how quickly the impossible can become inevitable when small failures cascade into catastrophe. The Titanic sinking wasn't just a maritime disaster, it was a lesson in physics, psychology, sociology, and human nature. It revealed how the same qualities that built the ship, confidence, ambition, the belief that human ingenuity could solve any problem, also contributed to its destruction. The unsinkable ship sank not despite human achievement, but because of the very human tendency to believe our own publicity, to trust our technology more than our caution, to assume that past success guarantees future safety. The survivors will spend the rest of their lives processing what they experienced during those 2 hours and 40 minutes. Some will become advocates for maritime safety. Others will try to forget, to rebuild their lives without dwelling on the night when the impossible became reality. All will carry the knowledge that they lived through one of history's great disasters, that they survived when 1,500 others did not, and that their survival was due more to circumstance than to virtue. The story of the Titanic is ultimately the story of a single night when the normal rules stopped applying, when social conventions became matters of life and death, when technology failed and human nature was tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. It's a story that continues to fascinate us because it reveals truths about ourselves that we'd rather not acknowledge, truths about how fragile our civilization really is, and how quickly everything can change when the unthinkable becomes reality. The mathematics of maritime rescue in 1912 were as unforgiving as the North Atlantic itself. When the Carpathia finally arrived at the coordinates where the Titanic had transmitted its final distress signal, Captain Arthur Rostron faced a search area of nearly 50 square miles scattered with lifeboats, debris, and bodies. The ocean had already begun to claim the evidence of the disaster, swallowing life preservers and personal effects into depths that wouldn't be explored for another 73 years. Your survival story doesn't end when you climb aboard the Carpathia. If you've made it this far, you're among the 710 who beat odds that killed over 1,500 others. But rescue brings its own set of challenges that most survival narratives gloss over. The transition from desperate survivor to traumatized passenger happens in the space of minutes, and your mind isn't prepared for the psychological whiplash. The first challenge is physical. You've spent anywhere from 4 to 8 hours in an open lifeboat, exposed to freezing temperatures, salt spray, and the constant fear that your boat might be swamped by waves or overwhelmed by desperate swimmers. Your clothes are soaked through. Your hands and feet show signs of frostbite. Some passengers can barely walk when they're hauled aboard the rescue ship, their joints locked from hours of immobility in cramped boats. The Carpathia's crew performs miracles of improvisation. They rig cargo nets and rope ladders, transforming their passenger liner into a rescue vessel in a matter of hours. Stewards give up their own uniforms to clothe survivors who escaped in nightgowns. The ship's doctor works around the clock, treating hypothermia, shock, and injuries sustained during the evacuation. Passengers who had booked passage to the Mediterranean suddenly find themselves sharing cabins with strangers who've lost everything except their lives. But the psychological challenges prove more difficult than the physical ones. Survivor's guilt begins almost immediately. Why did you live when the person next to you in the lifeboat queue died? Why did your lifeboat launch when others couldn't be lowered? Why did you have the strength to climb the rope ladder when others fell back into the sea? These questions will haunt survivors for decades, questions without satisfying answers. The class distinctions that determined survival on the Titanic don't disappear with rescue. First-class survivors are accommodated in the Carpathia's best cabins. Third-class survivors are housed wherever space can be found, often in crew quarters or cargo areas hastily converted to makeshift dormitories. Even in rescue, your ticket class continues to determine your treatment. Some survivors never speak about their experience. Others can't stop talking about it. The ones who maintain their silence often suffer more in the long run, the trauma eating away at them from inside. But the ones who talk obsessively about the disaster face their own problems. People grow tired of hearing the same stories, the same what-ifs, the same survivor's guilt dressed up as survivor's testimony. The journey to New York takes 3 days, and during those 3 days, the survivors begin to process what they've experienced. Some passengers who seemed fine immediately after rescue begin to break down as the shock wears off. Others who were hysterical in the lifeboats find unexpected reserves of strength and begin helping other survivors cope with their trauma. Children often adapt better than adults, their minds more flexible, less burdened by understanding the full implications of what they've survived. But they face their own challenges. Many have been separated from parents during the evacuation. Some are traveling alone, their guardians among the lost. The lucky ones are reunited with family members in other lifeboats. The unlucky ones become orphans in a single night, their futures entirely uncertain. The wireless room aboard the Carpathia becomes the center of frantic activity as survivors try to send messages to relatives, letting them know they're alive. But the ship's wireless system is overwhelmed. Messages pile up faster than they can be transmitted. Families waiting in New York receive fragmentary information, names of survivors mixed with names of the lost, creating cruel false hopes and devastating confirmations. Meanwhile, the world press begins to take notice. This isn't just a maritime accident, it's the story of the century. The unsinkable ship has sunk. The cream of society has perished alongside immigrants seeking new lives in America. The disaster cuts across all social boundaries, making it impossible to ignore or dismiss as someone else's tragedy. But the press coverage creates its own problems for survivors. Reporters begin boarding tugboats in New York Harbor, trying to reach the Carpathia before it docks. Photographers prepare to capture images of traumatized survivors. The disaster that began as a private nightmare is about to become public spectacle, and the survivors aren't prepared for the attention. Your experience as a Titanic survivor depends partly on who you were before the disaster and partly on who the press decides you should become afterward. Margaret Brown's assertiveness in the lifeboats transforms her into the unsinkable Molly Brown, a symbol of American resilience and frontier spirit. But the real Margaret Brown is a complex woman whose heroism gets simplified into newspaper sound bites and popular mythology. Other survivors find themselves cast in roles they never auditioned for. J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line managing director who escaped in a lifeboat, becomes the villain of the story, the coward who saved himself while women and children drowned. His survival becomes a scandal that destroys his reputation and haunts him for the rest of his life. The same rescue that saves his body destroys his soul. The crew members who survive face particular scrutiny. Why did they live when so many passengers died? Were they heroes who stayed at their posts until the end, or cowards who abandoned their duties? The truth, as usual, is more complicated than the headlines suggest. Some crew members performed heroically, others made mistakes or poor judgments under impossible pressure. Most fell somewhere in between, ordinary men doing extraordinary jobs under circumstances no training could have prepared them for. As the Carpathia approaches New York, the survivors face decisions that will shape the rest of their lives. Do they speak to the press or maintain their privacy? Do they testify at the inevitable investigations or try to forget what happened? Do they sue the White Star Line for negligence or accept that disasters sometimes happen despite everyone's best efforts? The legal battles will drag on for years. Survivors and families of the lost file hundreds of lawsuits seeking compensation for deaths, injuries, and lost property. The White Star Line's lawyers argue that the disaster was an act of God, unforeseeable and unavoidable. Survivors' lawyers argue that negligence and cost-cutting created the conditions that turned an accident into a catastrophe, but legal proceedings that can't address the deeper questions raised by the disaster. How do you assign monetary value to a human life? How do you compensate a widow for the loss of her husband or parents for the death of their children? How do you calculate damages for trauma that will last a lifetime? The survivors also face practical challenges that have nothing to do with courts or compensation. Many lost everything they owned when the ship went down: clothing, jewelry, family heirlooms, business documents, everything except what they grabbed during the evacuation. Some passengers were traveling with their entire life savings in cash or jewelry, planning to start new businesses or buy property in America. That money now lies on the ocean floor with everything else. Insurance companies face their own nightmare of claims and investigations. The Titanic disaster represents one of the largest insurance losses in maritime history. Policies covering the ship itself, the cargo, passenger belongings, and loss of life create a web of financial liability that takes years to untangle. The shipping industry begins implementing changes even before the investigations are complete. The disaster exposes so many safety deficiencies that reforms become inevitable. Ships will carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, not just enough to ferry passengers to rescue vessels. Radio operators will maintain 24-hour watches. Ice patrol services will track iceberg movements and broadcast warnings to ships in affected areas. These changes will save thousands of lives in future disasters, but they come too late for the 1,500 who died in the North Atlantic. Their deaths purchased safety improvements with a currency no one wanted to spend. Every new regulation, every additional lifeboat, every improved communication system bears the invisible inscription, "In memory of those lost on the Titanic." The disaster also changes how people think about technology and progress. The early 20th century had been marked by tremendous optimism about human achievement. Electricity, automobiles, powered flight, modern medicine all suggested that human ingenuity could solve any problem, overcome any obstacle. The Titanic represented the pinnacle of this technological confidence, the ultimate expression of man's dominion over nature. But the ship's destruction in a single night shattered that confidence permanently. If the most advanced ship ever built could be destroyed by a chunk of ice, what other disasters were lurking in humanity's technological future? The sinking introduced a note of caution, even pessimism, into the previously boundless optimism of the modern age. The survivors carry this knowledge with them as the Carpathia enters New York Harbor on the evening of April 18th, 1912. They've lived through the failure of that unsinkable ship, witnessed the collapse of technological hubris, survived the intersection of human ambition and natural force. Their experience will influence how society thinks about risk, safety, and the limits of human control over the natural world. But they also carry stories of human courage, dignity, and sacrifice that prove more enduring than the disaster itself. The band that played until the ship went under, the crew members who died at their posts, the passengers who gave up their seats in lifeboats so others might live. The disaster revealed the worst of human nature, but it also revealed the best. As tugboats guide the Carpathia toward Pier 54 in Manhattan, thousands of people wait on the docks, families hoping for reunions with survivors, reporters seeking interviews and photographs, officials preparing for investigations that will determine who was responsible for the disaster and how similar tragedies can be prevented in the future. The survivors face the rest of their lives knowing they beat odds that killed 1,500 others, knowing their survival was due more to circumstance than virtue, knowing they carry the memories of those who didn't make it home. Some will find meaning in their survival, using their experience to advocate for maritime safety or help other disaster survivors. Others will spend decades trying to forget, to rebuild their lives without dwelling on those 2 hours and 40 minutes when their world came apart. The Titanic disaster becomes a dividing line in history, a moment when the optimistic certainties of the early 20th century collided with the harsh realities of a universe that doesn't care about human ambitions or engineering achievements. The survivors become unwilling ambassadors from that collision, living reminders that progress isn't always progress, that the impossible can become inevitable with shocking suddenness. Your survival of the Titanic sinking doesn't end with rescue. It begins with rescue. The real test isn't whether you can survive 2 hours and 40 minutes in a sinking ship, but whether you can survive the decades that follow, carrying the knowledge of what you've seen and experienced, living with the randomness of who lived and who died, trying to find meaning in survival when so many others found only death in the cold North Atlantic. The ship may be gone, resting in pieces on the ocean floor, but its story continues in the lives of those who lived through its destruction. They carry the Titanic with them wherever they go, a ghost ship sailing through their memories, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed certainties can disappear beneath the waves in a single night when human ambition meets the implacable forces of the natural world. The numbers tell the final story with mathematical brutality. 710 survivors out of 2,224 souls aboard, a survival rate of 32%. But those numbers hide the deeper mathematics of disaster, the cruel equations that determined who lived and who died, based on factors entirely beyond individual control. If you were a woman in first class, you had a 97% chance of survival. Only 4 first-class women died that night, and 3 of those chose to stay with their husbands rather than enter the lifeboats. If you were a man in steerage, you had a 16% chance of making it home. The ship's design The loading procedures, the social conventions of 1912 all conspired to create a disaster where your ticket price predicted your survival with deadly accuracy. The aftermath reveals truths about human nature that society would spend decades trying to process. Investigations begin immediately, both in Britain and America, but they focus on technical failures and regulatory shortcomings rather than the deeper questions raised by the survival statistics. How do you explain to a democratic society that in the ultimate test of human equality, money determined who lived and who died? The survivors scatter to their separate futures, carrying with them fragments of a story too large for any single person to understand completely. Some become advocates for maritime safety, turning their trauma into purpose. Others retreat from public attention, building quiet lives around the careful management of memory and grief. A few become professional survivors, touring the lecture circuit with polished versions of their experience. But all of them carry the knowledge that survival wasn't earned through virtue or courage. It was distributed according to the same social hierarchies that governed everything else in Edwardian society. The disaster didn't reveal hidden truths about human nature, so much as expose existing truths that polite society preferred to keep hidden. The ship itself becomes a symbol that grows larger than the actual disaster. Books, films, songs, and stories transform the Titanic from a maritime accident into a metaphor for human hubris, technological overconfidence, and the fragility of civilization. Each retelling adds new layers of meaning while often losing touch with the brutal simplicities of what actually happened that night. The real Titanic story isn't about romance or heroism or divine judgment. It's about a series of small failures that cascaded into catastrophe, about how quickly the impossible can become inevitable when human systems encounter forces they weren't designed to handle. It's about the mathematics of disaster, where survival depends more on where you start than on what you do once the crisis begins. The water temperature that killed 1,500 people in minutes. The locked gates that trapped third-class passengers below decks. The social conventions that filled lifeboats with first-class passengers while steerage families drowned. These weren't dramatic plot points in an epic tragedy. They were the predictable results of a system that valued some lives more than others, and when that system was tested by disaster, it performed exactly as designed. Your chances of surviving the sinking of the Titanic were determined before you ever stepped aboard the ship. They were written into your ticket class, your cabin assignment, your gender, your age. The heroic individual choices that fill the popular retellings were real, but they operated within constraints that made those choices largely irrelevant to the final outcome. The 1,500 who died weren't less brave or less deserving than the 700 who lived. They were simply on the wrong side of mathematics that they had no power to change. The disaster revealed that in extreme circumstances, survival often has less to do with individual merit than with the systems and structures that surround us. Systems we rarely notice until they fail catastrophically. As the last survivors pass away in the coming decades, taking their first-hand memories with them, the Titanic will transition from living history to permanent legend. The mathematical realities of that night, the uncomfortable truths about how societies function under extreme stress, will likely be forgotten in favor of more comforting narratives about heroism and sacrifice. But the core lesson remains as relevant today as it was in 1912. The systems we build, the hierarchies we accept, the assumptions we make about safety and technology, all of these shape how disasters unfold and who survives when they occur. The Titanic didn't sink because of bad luck or divine judgment. It sank because human beings built a system that prioritized luxury over safety, profit over precaution, social order over human equality. The ship lies now in two pieces on the ocean floor, slowly dissolving back into the sea that claimed it. But the questions it raises about human nature, about how we organize our societies and distribute our resources, about what we value when everything else is stripped away, these questions remain as sharp and uncomfortable as they were on that freezing April night in 1912. Could you have survived the sinking of the Titanic? The honest answer is that it probably wouldn't have mattered what you did, or how brave you were, or how quickly you recognized the danger. Your survival would have depended on factors determined long before the ship ever encountered that iceberg. Your ticket class, your cabin location, your position in the social hierarchy of 1912. Everything else, all the individual stories of courage and cowardice, played out within constraints that made the final outcome tragically predictable. And that brings us to the end of our journey through one of history's most analyzed disasters. The Titanic wasn't just a ship that sank. It was a mirror held up to an entire civilization, reflecting back uncomfortable truths about how we organize ourselves, who we value, and what we're willing to sacrifice when resources become scarce and time runs out. Tonight, we've walked through every decision point, every corridor, every moment where survival hung in the balance. We've seen how the mathematics of disaster played out in real time, how social class became a matter of life and death, how human psychology failed in the face of the unthinkable. The passengers who boarded that ship in Southampton weren't just buying passage to New York. They were unknowingly entering a lottery where the odds were rigged before the first ticket was sold. The most haunting aspect of the Titanic disaster isn't the scale of the loss, though 1,500 deaths in a single night remains staggering. It's the precision with which those deaths were distributed along existing social lines. The ship didn't create new inequalities. It simply revealed the ones that were already there, written into the deck plans and passenger manifests, embedded in the very structure of the society that built and sailed the unsinkable ship. The survivors who made it to New York carried more than trauma and grief. They carried the knowledge that chance, not choice, had determined their fate, that survival in the modern world might depend less on individual virtue than on systems and structures beyond any one person's control, that the confident march of progress could be stopped dead by something as simple and ancient as ice meeting steel in the darkness. We tell ourselves comfortable stories about the Titanic, stories about bands playing hymns and captains going down with their ships, stories that make disaster seem meaningful, heroic, divinely orchestrated. But the mathematical reality is colder and more unsettling. Most of the people who died that night weren't heroes or villains. They were ordinary passengers whose survival depended on factors they couldn't control, variables determined by accidents of birth and booking class rather than moral character or quick thinking. The ship that was supposed to represent the triumph of human engineering instead became a monument to human fallibility. not because the technology failed, though it did, but because the systems built around that technology reflected the prejudices and assumptions of the society that created them. The Titanic sank not just because of bad design or bad luck, but because of bad choices about who mattered and who didn't when the ultimate test arrived. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of that calm, starlit ocean, of the impossible ship sliding beneath the waves, of the voices calling across the dark water until they fade into silence. Perhaps you'll wonder what you would have done differently, how you might have beaten those terrible odds. But remember this: the real lesson of the Titanic isn't about individual heroism or cowardice. It's about the systems we build and the assumptions we embed in them. It's about how quickly civilization can revert to its most basic hierarchies when survival is at stake. It's about the uncomfortable truth that in extreme circumstances, your fate might depend less on your courage than on your cabin number. The Titanic has been resting on the ocean floor for over a century now, slowly returning to the sea that claimed it. The ship may be gone, but the questions it raises about human nature, about how we organize our societies and distribute our chances, remain as relevant today as they were on that freezing April night in 1912. Sweet dreams, and remember, sometimes the most important lessons come wrapped in the quietest tragedies, told in numbers that reveal more about who we are than any heroic tale ever could. The mathematics of disaster are written in water and ice, in locked gates and lifeboat davits, in the simple, brutal arithmetic of who lives and who dies when everything we think we know about fairness disappears beneath the waves.